Hello everybody! It's time for another weekly wrap-up. I went to see the opera last night. It was a 3-hour performance of Rigoletto and I enjoyed it, but I didn't get to bed until 1 a.m. I slept in and then I got up and I just feel rough, let's say. I think it might be the weather. I think that my allergies are back full time now. So let's go through what I read this past week. I think the first thing that I finished was Of Mice and Magic by Ursula Vernon, which is the second book in her Harriet the Hamster Princess series. These books are illustrated chapter books aimed at younger children. I'm not sure of the exact age range, but it's pretty young. So Harriet was cursed as a child, which made her essentially invincible until the curse was lifted, and she went off to be a knight and do daring things and fight giants and rescue princesses and stuff. And even though she's no longer invincible, she's still riding around having adventures and wielding her sword. And this one is a retelling of The 12 Dancing Princesses, where Harriet hears about a curse on the daughters of a mouse king, and she goes to the kingdom to help lift the curse and find out what's really going on. And that mouse king has got some issues with organizing things and naming all his daughters after the months and having a complete set. Yeah, Harriet is that character who notices those things and just kind of cocks her head and says, you know, that's really messed up and I don't think we should be doing that anymore. So yeah, I loved it. There's not that much to say about these. I'm not exactly a connoisseur of children's literature these days, but I enjoyed it. If I was in regular contact with small children, I would be giving this out left and right, but sadly I am not, so I'll just recommend it to all of you guys instead. Then I finished my buddy read of How to Be a Victorian by Ruth Goodman. I read this with Kelsey and Maya and I think we all really enjoyed it. I learned so much about just daily domestic and work life of Victorians from multiple social classes from this book, things I just never thought about. I have talked about this periodically throughout February, so I won't go into vast amounts of detail here, but it does cover getting up in the morning, what people wore, what they ate, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and their work hours, kind of the Industrial Revolution and its effect on the workforce and on children. And I think most of this is actually about city life, now that I think about it. I started watching episodes of Victorian Farm, which Ruth Goodman was on, and that is really about the agricultural life, animal husbandry, and the domestic life aspects, which Goodman is an expert in. But as I recall, this book is mainly set in the cities, and not rural life so much, though it is mentioned occasionally. So I very much enjoy this and I would recommend it if you are at all interested in what it was like to really live in the Victorian age. It's written a little bit matter-of-factly, it's actually quite dry. It's a lot of facts that need to be imparted, and it's written in a very workmanlike way. And I could see this being boring if you don't like Goodman's personality. She definitely leavens the entire thing with her own experience, her anecdotes, and her humor, and that really brings the material to life to hear her talking about her own experience with the techniques and the way of life and everything. But if you don't like Goodman's personality, it might not work so much for you. But I really enjoyed it, and I believe there's a follow-up about the Edwardian age, and I think I'll have to see if my library has that one. I finally returned to Black Science, which is a comic series written by Remender. I read the first volume of this about a year ago, I think, and I read volumes 2 and 3 this past week. This series is about Grant McKay, a scientist who invents this device called the Pillar, which lets people jump to parallel worlds. You can go to alternate versions of Earth. And he goes on a test mission of this device with his team and his children, and things go very wrong. They get stranded because somebody has sabotaged the device, and it keeps jumping, but they can't use it to get home. And the series becomes about how will they get home, can they fix what's been done to the device, but also staying alive, and I think in particular keeping McKay's children alive because they were never supposed to be there in the first place. When I read the first volume of this, I think I struggled with just tracking what was happening I liked the artwork, I liked the sense of motion and action in the artwork, and the colors. It's very vibrant, and that's something that I really like in my comics. But the writing of this one is not working for me. It's been very confusing for me throughout, and I also think that the character designs of most of the women in the story are very similar. I was constantly confusing the female characters with each other, and that doesn't help. So I decided to stop with this after the 3rd volume, even though I've seen from people's reviews on Goodreads that this is like when things change and the story gets better after this point. I'm done. I'm tired of fighting my way through understanding what's going on, and I hate Grant McKay. He is admittedly a terrible father and a terrible husband who's realized that finally and wants to make some sort of amends, but I'm just so through with it, and I don't find his character or his story arc that appealing. And I didn't get attached to any of the other characters after 3 volumes, so it's probably not for me anymore. I feel sad about that because I think it had a lot of promise for me at the beginning, but not so much anymore. And like I mentioned on Friday, I did reread Going Postal by Terry Pratchett. This is my 3rd time reading this book, though I listened to it on audiobook this time, narrated by Stephen Briggs, and I highly recommend that audiobook version. This is hands down my favorite Discworld novel of all time. It's not the first one that I read, it's not the last one. I think I read it somewhere in the middle when it was first published around 2004, 2005. 2004, yeah. So I read it pretty soon after it was published, and I absolutely loved it. This is the first of 3 books that follow the main character, Moist von Lipwig, who is a con artist and a swindler. At the beginning of Going Postal, he has been captured under his pseudonym of Alfred Spangler. He is sentenced to die for his crimes. He's just stolen a lot of money. And Vetinari, the tyrant of Ankh-Morpork, has him hanged to within an inch of his life, then brings him back under his real name of Moist von Lipwig and tells him he has to be the postmaster of the Ankh-Morpork postal system, which has been a deadly job for the 4 previous people who attempted it, because Vetinari wants the postal system to compete with the clack system. He thinks some healthy competition would be a good idea. So Moist sets off to deliver the mail and it's great. I love it so much. I'm trying to think of how to explain what it is that I personally love so much about the Moist von Lipwig stories, because all 3 of them, Going Postal, Making Money, and Raising Steam, follow the same structure where Moist is assigned to resurrect or revolutionize a system in the city. You have the post office, then you have the banks, and then Raising Steam is the railroad, I believe. I don't remember that one very well. So it's Moist taking on a system and like an architecture, part of the city, and dealing with it. And this is something that I really enjoy. I like breaking down systems and rebuilding them and seeing how a process works and just like building the machine and seeing it working in its well-oiled state or whatever. I love it. And there are just moments in Going Postal that I cheer a little bit inside at. It's like the simple things like stamps are invented, and then the birth of stamp collecting and Stanley switching from pins to stamps. Like it's a great moment. So many little things in this book. I'm getting incoherent here, but I love it. I don't know if it's one of the more highly regarded Discworld novels. I do think that it was nominated for a Hugo Award, and I'm not sure that many of the Discworld novels actually were. I don't think Terry Pratchett ever won a Hugo Award, actually. So I love it, I recommend it, and it's not a bad place to start with Discworld at all. You can pretty much jump in wherever you want to, but Moist is also a really good character. I think a lot of people will really enjoy. So I reread it. I'm sure I'll reread it many times in the future, and I am on to Making Money right now. And the last thing that I finished this week was Kings of the Wyld by Nicholas Eames. It's a pretty chunky fantasy novel. This is what I'd call like the tits, booze, and blood version of fantasy. I'm not into the descriptions of violence and gore and fight scenes and battle mayhem, so I tuned a lot of that out in this book. So it's about some long retired members of a once legendary mercenary band who made a name for themselves, like many other mercenary bands, fighting monsters. And they have been disbanded and retired for a long time, but they get back together to rescue the daughter of one of their members, who herself is a mercenary but is trapped in a city under siege by a humongous horde of monsters. So they set off to gather together all of the band members, convince them to go on this one last adventure, and then they have to cross a very, very big forest of nasty things to actually get to the city, and then face down the huge army and somehow get out of there with Rose, the daughter. So this has like a joke in every paragraph. It's meant to be like that. And I enjoyed the characters, the interactions, getting to know their history together, and a lot of those in-jokes, you know, like the fact that they can never keep a bard, all their bards die. Even though this is fantasy set in kind of a medieval-esque setting, it felt really modern in the way the characters talked. Some of the jokes, for example, like, my sense of humor was surgically removed at birth, but I actually recognized a lot of the jokes as jokes and as references to internet jokes and memes, like, the cake is a lie. That's in here. And it's not completely my sense of humor either. Like, I actually chuckled at a few things, but I almost feel like the humor went overboard trying to hammer home how funny it all was. But it could be that I don't have the greatest sense of humor or something. So it was enjoyable for the most part, just because it has a lot of fun elements. The probably saving grace of the book for me is that it was written from the perspective of Clay, who is the much more ordinary person in the band. He's convinced to go along because his own daughter basically says, well, if it was me, you would go, right? But he spends most of the book really wanting to go home to his wife and young daughter. But I think his perspective really grounds the novel. The other people in the band are just kind of crazy characters, and he is the ordinary person that I think readers can empathize with a bit more. You know, we can see ourselves in him. So it was good. Not completely my thing, even at the end after I enjoyed most of it. I am glad that I did read it though. It's one of those things that I would never have picked up to read, except that I needed to read it for the BooktubeSFF awards, and it ended up being a good read, and I need to be pushed out of my comfort zone every once in a while. This book is nominated in the debut category in the awards, and that's a category that I'll be judging. So I was reading this thinking about how it ranked as a debut novel, and I think it's actually a really good book, a very strong story from a first-time author, and I was mainly impressed by the self-aware aspect of the book. This is a fantasy novel that knows it's a particular type of fantasy novel. It's clearly aware of the stereotypes and the cliches, the aspects that people really love, and it uses those aspects intelligently, and it subverts and twists some of those cliches to make it really interesting and to add more depth, especially to the characters. And I think that that self-aware aspect of this is pretty hard to pull off, and I think it was done well here. It wasn't pushed too far, it didn't become overwhelming. It balanced the old and the expected with new ways of doing things that I think readers today will really appreciate. So that is something I really admire about this book. And that is everything that I read this past week. I think I'm done filming because both of my legs are numb, and this is why I don't usually sit on the floor. Anyway, I have to go off and do other things like starting some seeds and sawing board so I can construct a new garden bed. I hope that you've had a good and productive weekend, and I will talk to you again soon. And until then, bye.